Hello, this is Robert Morrow here, interviewing Jan Amos of Dallas, Texas. Today is July 31st, 2014. Jan is the former wife of Colonel William Henry Amos, who was very high up in Air Force intelligence. His boss was Brigadier General Joseph J. Cappucci.
Correct.
And Cappucci had some very interesting things to tell Jan Amos at a dinner in 1969. So let's just show Jan there. So Jan, so apparently you were a military wife for a very long time, correct?
25 years.
Okay. And what was the position that your husband held by the time he reached the late 1960s?
In the early 60s, he was security for presidents when they wanted to use military that didn't. The Secret Service said there were a lot of kooks that knew all the Secret Service. So they used Bill Amos, because nobody knew him, for presidents that were, let's say, in high-level danger or something, or when they wanted to make sure that nobody knew who actually was the Secret Service for him.
So he was in protection for
Right.
VIPs, whether it would be an
Right.
ambassador or a president,
Right.
or so forth. What did Bill Amos say about guarding Lyndon Johnson? Like, what kind of a guy he was? And go ahead and give us the unvarnished truth of what he said about LBJ.
Oh, when he guarded LBJ, he said he was the most uncouth SOB he ever met.
Okay, and why would he say that?
Because he was rude, he was obnoxious, he just absolutely, it's the first time I've ever heard him say anything about a president in that way, and he really did not like the man at all, did not like dealing with him, but it was his job.
He basically, Johnson was just personally an ogre, an beast. Obnoxious. Was he often drunk?
He didn't mention whether he drank or not. He just mentioned he was himself. He was just a personal ogre. He just was evidently an awful person to be around, to guard and to be with personally.
And your husband would come home and tell you these stories about LBJ?
Yeah, he would come home and shake his head and said that's the most uncouth, the worst he ever said about anyone, the most uncouth SOB he ever met.
Okay, many folks have said that. Okay, well, the reason we're here today is because in 1969, you were telling me and some others, author Phil Nelson, that you were at a dinner party in Rome, Italy, where your husband's boss, General Joseph J. Cappucci, had some interesting things to say about the JFK assassination. Could you give us the setting for that, and how the topic of the Kennedys came up, and how, you know, it was the time of Chappaquidick and Ted Kennedy? Go ahead.
Okay. In the beginning, he was telling us about his close friendship with J. Edgar Hoover.
Who was telling you this?
General Cappucci told us one of his best friends was J. Edgar Hoover, and I, of course, assumed that J. Edgar Hoover and he talked a great deal about what was happening, and he told us that during the Cappucci situation with Ted Kennedy,
Mary Jo Cappucci,
Chappaquidick, that he got out of the car to, quote, take a leak, and when he did, the car rolled into the beach area, into the water, and she was left in the car, and he just turned around and walked away, and that later
meaning Ted Kennedy just turned around and walked.
Yeah, he turned around, and then that whole story about him swimming and all that was a complete lie.
So who was Cappucci getting this information from on Chappaquidick?
On Chappaquidick, definitely from J. Edgar Hoover.
His close personal friend.
Absolutely, and told us that the true story of what had happened, and that the girl had probably lived an hour or more that she was drunk, and that he didn't bother to do anything. He could have opened a car door and probably dragged her out, but instead he walked away, and that later that the Kennedys paid the Cappucci family $1 million to be quiet about what had happened. And of course he was incensed about this, and then he talked more about how
Cappucci was incensed about this.
Yeah, was about it, and J. Edgar Hoover,
yeah.
and talked about the fact that he did, of course, disliked the Kennedys, and along with the conversation, everyone was drinking some, and the general was drinking quite a bit, so
Okay.
was my husband. And then it went into fact, got kind of angry, and he said outright, "No wonder LBJ had JFK killed." He didn't say assassinated. No wonder LBJ had JFK killed.
Okay, so that came out of the words
out of the mouth of
Air Force Brigadier General Joseph J. Cappucci in the year 1969
Yes.
at a dinner at the Hilton in Rome. Is that correct? Is that where you were at?
Yes, we were at the Hilton in Rome. There had been a really big dinner of all the ambassadors prior to that, but this was after the dinner, and it was only General Cappucci and my husband and I at this small table when he made that statement.
Was Cappucci's wife at the table as well?
No, he was the only one there.
So there were 3 people at the dinner table.
Right.
Name those 3 people at the dinner table.
My husband, Bill Amos, myself, and General Cappucci, the 3 people at the table.
What did your husband tell you on the way home that night after you'd heard that from General Cappucci that Lyndon Johnson had killed John Kennedy?
Bill Amos said to me, "Don't ever repeat that. Never repeat what you just heard, Jen. Don't ever, under any circumstances." And he had never told me anything like that before, but he was really adamant in the fact that I was never to repeat what General Cappucci said.
So your husband was a colonel in Air Force Intelligence.
Yes.
Is it Lieutenant Colonel or Colonel Amos?
It was Lieutenant Colonel.
Lieutenant Colonel William Henry Amos, who was working directly under Air Force Brigadier General Joseph J. Cappucci.
Correct.
And Cappucci was very high up in counterintelligence.
Well, he was the head of the Air Force Intelligence of everywhere. He was the top general, excuse me.
And he was telling you that he was close personal friends with J. Edgar Hoover.
Oh, so they were friends for life. They had been boyhood friends. He said that he didn't call him J. Edgar. I can't remember the little name he called him, but he said that they were lifetime friends.
He had a nickname for J. Edgar Hoover.
Yes, and I can't remember.
Was it the nickname Bulldog?
That might have been it. Was something I cannot remember now, but he didn't call him J. Edgar Hoover. He called him that nickname. It might have been
But he was obviously talking about Hoover, though.
It was obviously talking about someone he knew very close, was very close to.
Great. Okay, I want to go into the story about your husband, Colonel Amos, being in charge of destroying all the copies of a book called A Texan Looks at Lyndon, A Study in Illegitimate Power. This book came out in 1964. It was extremely popular, especially in Texas. The legend is it sold more copies than the Bible that year. I don't know if that's true or not. But it is an early and I think well-justified hit piece on Lyndon Johnson. If you read this book, the author implies that Lyndon Johnson was involved in murders covering up the Billy Sol Estes investigation of a few years before. So this book came out just a few years after the Billy Sol Estes scandal and his links to LBJ. So, Jan, when this book came out, what orders did your husband, Colonel William Henry Amos, receive in 1964?
He received orders from the Commander-in-Chief, President of the United States, to go into the PX and commissaries and everywhere on the military base that he was on and remove those books and see that they were incinerated, that they were burned. And he was kind of disgusted about it because it was absolutely amazing for a president to give these orders to commanders and intelligence. So he had to go, had to see every time they were delivered. It just wasn't one delivery. They would have deliveries and deliveries, and he had to personally make sure every case of books was taken to the incinerator, and he had to stand there, and he had to see that they were burned. And he was disgusted by it, so I said to him, Bill, get me one of those books. I want to read it. I mean, it really piqued my curiosity.
Right.
And I said, bring one home. He said, are you kidding? He said, if I brought one of those books home, I could be court-martialed. He said, no way can you ever have that book. He said, this is an order from the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States.
So it's a direct order from President Lyndon Johnson ordering military intelligence to destroy every copy of a Texas Looks at Lyndon on every single military base in the United States.
Absolutely, all of them. They were just on one, in charge of one base. Every base, I mean, everyone in the United States, every military officer had to follow this important war rule of the president.
Of Lyndon Johnson.
Oh.
Well, that's a fascinating story, Jan.
And by the way, I have the book, and I'm so thrilled. I had to wait 50 years to get that book. A friend in Dallas had it, and all my life I wanted to read it. I wanted to see what was so important that Bill had to spend months getting rid of it. So I have the book. I'm very proud of having it. I don't think I'll get court-martialed.
Beautiful. I want to talk about the Dallas social scene and the prominent wives of the prominent men who you served when you were working in retail, fashion retail in Dallas. So let's go through family by family, and maybe you can tell us about the personalities of the women who you worked with. How about the Murkison family first? Tell us your experiences with them.
Okay. Well, Jenny was delightful. And she used to come into...
Right, or Jenny who?
Virginia Murkison, excuse me. Everybody called her Jenny.
And she's the wife of
She was the
Clint
wife
Murkison.
of Clint
The older
Murkison.
Clint, right?
The
patriarch, okay? The inner circle LBJ supporter.
Absolutely. And she was delightful. She was a lot of fun. She was pleasant. She would come in to say to Harrison, I would have a Judith Lieber handbag that was quite expensive. And I'd say, Jenny, look at this. She said, charge it to me, and walk out. In a period of time, I would go to Chanel and get Chanel clothes when they were on sale in Highland Park and take them to Virginia and have her try them on, and she would purchase what she wanted, and I'd take the rest back. And she was just delightful. I met Clint on a few occasions.
Tell us about the times you met Clint Murkison.
Well, it would just be when I was at the house. I would bring Virginia clothing, and also I was very close friends and close to Luby Murkison, who was, of course, John Murkison's wife.
Oh, let's be clear. John Murkison is the son of Clinton Murkison, and Luby was his wife, right?
And Luby was his wife.
Okay, tell us about her and him.
And, of course, Clint and John were brothers, you know.
Well,
and it was John Murkison that was sort of the business side of the family. And Clint was kind of the cowboy. Of course, he started the Cowboys. Clint was kind of the maverick in the family, and it was John that kind of really kept...
Oh, you're talking about Clint, who was the owner of the Dallas Cowboys,
right,
but not his father, who was also Clint Murkison. You're talking about a younger Clint Murkison.
Oh, okay. Am I into the younger... Okay.
Okay, so you knew Jenny and Clint, the younger Murkisons.
Right.
Okay, all right. And so his brother was John.
With John.
And Lupe. Okay, tell us about. So were they nice people? Were they fun to deal with?
Lupe was wonderful. The way I met her would be one night.
Well, what did she look like?
Oh, she was a very dark-haired, kind of tall, attractive, just full of personality. And one night, I didn't know her, but I'm working at Sanger Harris, and this lady comes in. And then we were selling Anne Klein merchandise, couturier, and she came in and we took all these clothes in my private dressing room, and she said, "Get me a broom or a coat hanger or something."
Lupe said that, right?
Lupe said that. I thought, how strange. So she would put the clothes on, and she would get that coat hanger, and she would do like this. Do like this. Be sure. She said, "I'll take that one." She and John and Clint and Jenny were going to Africa on a safari, and they all used their weapons on her and make sure the coats were big enough that she could fire a gun while she was in Africa.
On safari in Africa.
On safari in Africa.
Lupe
did, and I mean, I just took them to there. Then one of her daughters married, and I helped her. They were delightful people. I didn't know John, I see him as often, but later on, John had asthma, really bad asthma. Lupe, this story came from Lupe. He had a terrible attacks of asthma, and and he was at the governor of Texas home. What was that, Clint? The governor of Texas.
Well, it depends on. Don't worry about that.
It doesn't matter. He was there, and he had an asthma attack.
What year was this?
This would have been. I'm sorry, I don't know the year, but it would have been
1970s, maybe.
No, not earlier than the 70s.
Okay.
And he got sick, and instead of calling an ambulance to give him oxygen, they put him in a police car to take him to the hospital. They had a minor wreck on the way to the hospital. Lupe was used to him having to have oxygen, ran to the hospital, and a doctor came out and told her he was dead. Oh, she was terrified. Lupe and John Murchison were the closest married people I've ever done.
Was he really dead, or was it a mistake?
He was dead. Oh, no, he died.
Okay.
He died, and from that very day, Lupe and Jenny blamed, the governor of Texas.
Don't even
blamed him the fact that John Murchison was not treated like he should have been treated on the way to the ambulance call. And that was kind of the downfall of the Murchison family, because John was the business one. And thereafter it was Clint that went into these wall things, and as you know, they eventually lost everything. Right. Clements, am I saying that? I think it was Governor Clements was the governor. But
okay, I don't know for a fact. You can look it up whenever John Murchison passed away.
But they were a very close family. And Jenny Murchison, the reason he married her, his wife had died, is because she had two brothers, and Virginia's brothers taught her how to hunt, and when she went hunting with him, he fell in love and they married.
With Clint?
Yeah, with Clint.
The owner of the Dallas Cowboys.
The owner of the Cowboys, and she had worked at Neiman Marcus. She was a salesperson.
Okay. What were the various retail stores that you worked at? I know Bloomingdale's is one of them. What are some other places that you worked at?
I started out at Sanger Harris as a fashion consultant. Okay. And from there, because Bloomingdale's was federated, I was transferred to Bloomingdale's. And there I helped Margot Morrow, who was delightful, and some of the very big, prominent people in Dallas.
At Bloomingdale's.
At Bloomingdale's. Okay. And then from Bloomingdale's I retired, or rather there was an accident, my family, and I had to retire. And then I went to work for a little store called Mary Nash. But all of those 80s were where the fashion stores in Dallas, there was just Neiman's, Bloomingdale's, Sanger Harris. We didn't have all the Saks Fifth Avenue. And so everybody needed a personal shopper, and I was fortunate to do that. And they were lovely people.
You were a personal shopper for the social elite of Dallas, Texas.
Right.
And you had a great
Right.
time doing it.
Yeah, and a couple of them were Dallas's best dressed, so I was very fortunate, and they were wonderful people.
A couple of your clients were the Dallas best dressed.
Right.
And who were? Could you name those?
Well, Linda Gibbons was one, and she was best dressed for 3 or 4 years.
Okay.
I think Nancy Strauss. I'm sorry, at my age, I'm not into remembering names.
Is that Robert
like I
Strauss's
should.
wife?
Yes.
Okay.
And just the very one that I did her whole wardrobe for was Bobby Folsom's wife, Margaret Folsom. When Bobby was the mayor of Dallas,
Okay.
I dressed Margaret, and we became great friends. I dressed her the whole time he was the mayor of
Okay.
Dallas, so it was a nice thing.
You were
to
dressing
know
the
these
First
people.
Lady of Dallas.
Right, and as I said, and Margaret Perot.
I want to talk about the Hunt family.
Okay.
Tell us about who in the H.L. Hunt family that you knew, the wives and maybe the sons, their names, and who you knew personally.
I did tell you the truth, I wasn't as familiar with the Hunts as I was the Murchisons and the Perots.
Okay, well, tell us about Margot Perot and
Okay.
working with her. I want to hear about that.
Well, the surprising thing about Margot Perot and those daughters was the fact that many times when they shopped, everybody thought to bring out the most expensive and all this, that, and the other. And they weren't that way at all. They were very conservative. So when I worked at Singer's,
Meaning financially. They
were just conservative about their choice and conservative about the price. And when the girls would come to me, they would be in high school then. There was a line called Perry Ellis that fit them. They were kind of short and not easy to fit. And she would let the girls come in. Then I would hold the things and dress them. And then Margot would come in and she would charge them and what have you, and I'd take them to the house. So, but they were not... She was not happy with people that tried to come out with all the big expensive things because she was Margot Perot, really conservative.
Frugal, even.
Well, maybe to the point of a little bit frugal. But one time, if you have time for this, that I was delivering clothes to Margot was when the people had been kidnapped in Iraq. Remember when there were people held?
Iran,
excuse me.
1979 time
Right.
period. Are we talking about that?
Okay, yeah, we're talking about 1979. And of course, Ross had his whole house was guarded because there were all these threats against Margot and their children from Iraq because they had kidnapped.
Was it Iraq or Iran or when a Perot employee got kidnapped in the Middle East? Which one are we talking about?
It was when the Perots were kidnapped.
When the Perot employee.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know what year that was, but okay.
Well,
so
I have to get the book. I have a book that they signed for me.
Okay.
And while that was going on, he had a lot of security, and I go with this, with these clothes for the girls and everything, and hangers make a loud noise.
Clattering.
Okay, so I'm in my trunk getting the clothes out, and I hear the dog. And now I am familiar with guard dogs.
Right.
And I want to tell you, it's the most frightening thing you ever heard. So I'm standing there, and the man's behind me and say, "Ma'am," he said, "just lift your hands out of there and let me see." And right behind me was this guard dog that was growling. I never was so frightened. And I stepped back, and that's what you had to do when you went to their house at that time, was because he was surrounded by guard dogs, guards, and everything.
At the H. Ross Perot house.
At the house
Margot.
on Straight Lane.
On Straight Lane?
Right.
Okay. All right. Well, Jan, let's transition back into some of your stories of the early years being with William Henry Amos. Specifically, take us back to Little Rock in the 1950s when Dwight Eisenhower brought in the National Guard for integration of the black kids into those schools. Tell us about that, because you were there at that time. Tell us about that.
We were stationed on the base, and my husband was then in charge of the base security.
Little Rock, Arkansas.
Arkansas base security, the military security. And at that time, the elementary school was off of the military base on Arkansas land. It wasn't on the military base. And children had to be bused maybe 10 or 15 minutes from the base. They went through base housing, collect the elementary children out the road and out to this elementary school. And during that period, it was really terrible because people were throwing rocks at the buses and threatening the buses, calling on the phone to military police, threatening to blow up the military school because, as you know, we are integrated. We had black, Chinese, American, every nationality military, because the blacks' blood is red just like ours. Right. They would scream. People would be lined up there and throw rocks and things at these buses and say that they didn't want those little niggers in their schools.
And so
was really frightening.
Was your husband in charge of security?
He was in charge of security, so we had to put a military policeman on every bus. And then for 24 hours, the school was guarded to make sure nobody could put a bomb under it. And that was the same period where they had to call the National Guard out to get 2 black people into college in Little Rock.
Or into high school, I think.
Was it high school then?
It was. I think it was high school in Little Rock.
At any rate, it was a terrible time, and it was hard to believe that Americans would feel that way about elementary children.
Right. Okay, I want to transition back to the JFK assassination and where you and your husband were when John Kennedy got killed, where you were stationed, if you could talk to us about that. This would obviously be November 22nd, 1963.
Right. We were in England at the time. We were stationed in England, and Bill was in intelligence. And while we were there, he said to me, Jan, when he came out, you know the British have no guns. They carry bobby sticks, and the violence is unbelievable. And he said to me, Jan, he said, don't tell anybody you're from Dallas, Texas. And I thought, that was so sad, so I made a point not to do it. Then the general's aide got ill and had to be flown back to the United States, and Bill Amos became the general's aide. So
in London?
In England. We were stationed at High Wycombe, England, and the general then was commander of all the English American troops and was invited to the very high level things, and we would go with him, and we sat in, I suppose it was amazing, a box, and the Queen was there, which is practically unheard of. And then we were invited to Henley Regatta and to the races and all the high British things, kind of like My Fair Lady. And it was an interesting life. And Bill said to me, oh, Jan, he said, do not tell them where you're from. They will absolutely have a fit. Don't let anyone know that you're from Dallas, Texas.
And this was in the wake of the JFK assassination.
And this was in the wake of the JFK assassination, and every military base had a mock funeral for John F. Kennedy. Our church had a funeral with a flag on it. It was just unbelievable. And, of course, the British were absolutely shocked about Dallas, and also I wanted to be real careful. Didn't want the royalty to ever find out. So it was a really difficult time in my life, being from Dallas.
Right, okay. Let's talk about the years that your husband was stationed in Rome. He was a military guard for the ambassador. And tell us the Claire Luce Booth story, where she had gotten really sick and people were wondering if she was being poisoned or not.
Well, this was before we were stationed in Rome, but they spent a long time intelligence trying to figure out why she had lead poisoning.
Ambassador Claire Luce Booth was very sick, and they couldn't figure out why she was sick. Okay,
she was in the hospital twice. They fired all the chefs, they hired new people, they constantly checked into it, and then when we got there, they were still investigating it until they found out that they had redone the embassy at that time. They had repainted it, redone everything, and evidently the old paint, the old lead paint, when they were redoing, had gotten in some of the food and was strong enough to have caused her to have lead poisoning. So thereafter, they decided that every ambassador should have a personal security guard. Okay. So when we got there, that's what Bill did. He was responsible for the life of Ambassador Martin, and we went to the events with them on every occasion when they were out with the Italians. So
he was like a high-level aide-de-camp, focusing on security, personal security, like going with him wherever he was. Every public appearance the ambassador would make, your husband would be nearby, you know, as a defense mechanism. And
he was also on the ambassador's staff, on the meeting, the staff, along with going out to protect him. So that was his personal job, which not many people knew. Really, the people there did not know what Bill's job was. But
did you know at the time what his job was?
Not really. I didn't know he was responsible for the life. I knew he was there with the ambassador, but I had no idea that he was responsible for the ambassador's life. But he had guarded LBJ and other presidents and Bobby Kennedy and all at other times, so I guess that was his position there.
Okay, so with the Hilton in Rome of that era, we're talking the late 1960s, would that be the place for folks to socialize, kind of like the place to be, so to speak?
Well, I think all the high-level things, all the people that came to Rome, this particular Hilton was the place they met. At one time, we had every ambassador from around the world met there for an ambassador's conference, or whatever you called it. Right. And that's when General Cappucci came over.
Now, General Cappucci, why don't you tell us how many times did you have personal interactions with Air Force Brigadier General Joseph J. Cappucci? Like a few times, a dozen times, 100 times?
Well,
how many times did you socially interact with him?
Probably we had been to occasions with him when Bill was stationed in Washington, D.C. That's where he was, and that's where General Cappucci would be, and we had been to social events that intelligence had. And then he came over a couple of times, but it certainly wasn't a real common thing. The night that we had dinner together it kind of happened after an event, and the three of us was there. But Bill was, of course, his fair-haired boy, as they say.
Your husband was the fair-haired boy for General
Cappucci. Yes, definitely.
Okay, tell us about your husband and your family life. How many children did you have with William Henry Amos?
3 daughters.
And about what years were they born? Can you remember just off the top of your head?
Oh, yeah, that would be the early, the 50s. All of them were born in the 50s. I was 21 years old at the time when the first one was born, and somewhere in the 50s to 55, say 56. We had 3 daughters.
So what year were you born again?
I was born in 1930.
Okay, so you got married in 1951, I guess?
I think 48.
Oh, you were 18.
I was only 18 years old.
Okay, 18 years old. And then you started having your children right after that in the 1950s.
Well, no, 3 years later, I was 21.
When the first one came, 51, right? You'd been married for 3 years.
Right.
And then and what was her name?
The oldest daughter's name is Gail.
Okay, and she was born in 51. The next daughter?
Is Dee, and I found out where children came from then. Because we had her about 18 months later, so she was just right away. Then 4 months later, we had our youngest daughter, Lisa.
Lisa.
Yeah.
Okay. Tell us about some of the stories that your husband told you about Vietnam, particularly some of the traumatic ones about him interviewing some teenage Vietnamese boys and then handing them back to the village, and how this affected him psychologically.
Okay, in Vietnam, Bill was Air Force intelligence in charge of the largest Air Force base there, Cameron Bay.
Okay.
And Cameron Bay had an interpreter that slept under his air-conditioned trailer.
Which was a big deal, having an air-conditioned trailer.
Yeah, well,
in Vietnam.
Yes, only commanders had air-conditioned trailers in Vietnam.
Okay.
And the interpreter slept with him and stayed with him constantly. He had to have an interpreter. And while he was there, they would run into maybe a VC, a VietCon, that would give information, and Bill would go out to get this intelligence information because the Vietnamese were experts at bombing.
Okay.
And they were trying to locate these areas that they were bombing the base from. So Bill would go out in a Jeep with 3 or 4 people and meet this VietCon, and he had $35 worth of American money in yen or in Vietnamese money.
How would he know he was a Viet Cong? He just assumed it?
Well, no, because see, all these intelligence, but his interpreters and all, also had Vietnamese intelligence
Contacts.
contacts out in the area.
Okay.
It didn't just happen, and they would finally meet a fellow that was willing to come and tell the colonel where some of the hot spots were to protect the base.
And so $35 back then is probably worth about $200 now.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that was a lot of money, and that's where they got the information. So they would go, and his interpreter would take the information.
Okay.
And the fellow would just be squatting down in the jungle, and then Bill was in a Jeep with 4 people in it to protect him, and they would drive away. Then the Green Beret would come up and cut the man's throat because they
cut
gave
the VC's throat.
The VC's throat. They give him the information because they didn't want him to be able to know the colonel.
So was your husband traumatized by this, or he just told you the story as a matter of fact?
It was just the way life was there. Life was very short there, and that's what they did. When the fellow gave the information, they killed him.
All right, tell us about when your husband had to interview the 2 Vietnamese boys whose fishing boat had gotten kind of blown off course. Okay, let's hear about that story.
Well, after Bill would sit down on the deck with us in Rome, and he would sometimes start telling the stories about Vietnam, because you were in Vietnam right before he came to Rome. And
so you were in Rome in the year '69 for sure.
Yeah.
And he was in Vietnam.
He was in Vietnam in about 63, 64.
Was he in Vietnam in '65, 6 or 7, or just 3 and 4?
I think it was. I'm not sure if it was during the Tet Offensive, so that you would have to figure out the year. I think he might have been there, or that would have been later.
Tet Offensive was January of 1968.
Oh, and then he was there earlier. He was there 64, 65.
Okay, so he'd be telling
We were in Rome by 68.
So by 68, he'd be telling you these stories, okay?
Right.
All right, so
Drunk, sitting out on the balcony.
So your husband was an alcoholic, obviously.
Well, he had become, because when he came back from Vietnam, and this happened to a lot of the military people, they never treated them for post-acute stress syndrome. They never treated them for anything unless they were wounded. So he treated himself with alcohol, and a lot of the military
stress, traumatic disorder, PTSD.
And most of those people now they're all dying of alcohol. Treated themselves with alcohol. At any rate, he had this night where they brought 2 teenagers. It was a girl and a boy.
Oh, it was a girl and a boy?
A
Really?
girl and a boy in this little boat.
How old were they, do you think they were?
They were teenagers. He said 12, 13 years old.
He said that?
Yeah, young kids.
Okay.
Well, he got their age from his interpreter, and they were fishing, which is what they had in their little boat, were some fish and a line, and a storm came up, and the rain and the wind blew them within the Cameron Bay safety area, and they were picked up by the military police and brought to my husband for interrogation to find out if they were VC.
Right.
And he spent 2 days interrogating them. They checked them out. There were no weapons. There was nothing in their little sampan but fish and fishing line. So he made the decision to take them back into the village near Cameron Bay and turn them over to the Vietnamese to return them to their family.
So he determined they were not VC, they were not enemy combats, they were just a boy and a girl, both very young,
Right.
barely even teenagers.
Right.
Okay, so what happened after your husband Bill Amos returned these children back to the village?
Okay, they went into the village. His interpreter always stayed with him, and they were squatting down in this grass hut type thing, and the village chief would be there and a few people, and he had his interpreter explain to the village chief that he had picked these teenagers up and he wanted to return them and wanted to have the village chief return them to their family. In the meantime, his interpreter kept pulling at his shoulders, trying to pull it back.
Bill's shoulders.
Yeah, at Bill's shoulders, trying to pull, and he trying to figure it out. And the two little kids were just squatting in front of him, and all of a sudden, somebody walked in with an M60 rifle or something and shot them both in the head. And just blew their brains all over.
In cold blood.
In cold blood.
And why'd they do that?
Because they just have nobody, how can you figure it out? They just figured they had the man said to Bill, the chief said to Bill, we show you what we do to VC.
Could you repeat that, what the village chief told Bill after they killed those two kids in Golden? What would he say?
He said, we show you how we treat VC. And Bill, it was devastating to him. So when he got back to the base, they cut the water off, and he had to bathe himself in vodka.
Tell us about the time that Bill Amos, your husband, a colonel very high in Air Force intelligence, told you what he thought about how they let John Kennedy get killed. What did he say to you, Jan?
Well, we were sitting out on the balcony in Rome. We used to sit out there, and unfortunately Bill drank even more when he was at home, and he was drinking pretty heavy. And he just suddenly said, or he said to me, he said, my God, he said, they let, the Secret Service let JFK get killed. And I thought, what is he talking about? He said, they didn't protect him. They didn't do anything. He said they weren't near. He said it was the most unheard of thing he ever saw. I don't know how he saw it, but I know he had an opinion at that time that was never said, that John F. Kennedy was killed because he didn't have protection.
So you don't know what Bill Amos based this on. You just know that he said, quote, my God, Jan, the security just let him get killed.
Let him get killed.
He did say that. We don't know why he said it, but we know he said that. What he based it on.
Absolutely. I had heard that before I ever thought of the film or anything. He just flat said they let him get killed.
Tell us about your husband, William Henry Amos, and his time in the Strategic Air Command, and what your experiences were there.
When he was in Strategic Air Command, SAC, all of the SAC people, Bill and crew know, were considered little gods because those men were responsible for bombing Russia. And many people didn't realize that it was a suicide mission. Everybody thought, oh, the SAC guys, and they really were. They were General LeMay's little gods. And General LeMay was kind of a strange man. I mean, he was you would talk about warmonger. General LeMay really wanted, I think ultimately, would like to have gotten into a war, but all the military.
We're talking General Curtis LeMay, the man who built the Strategic Air Command in the 1950s.
The father of SAC.
Was your husband a pilot in SAC?
No.
What was his role in the Strategic Air Command when he worked for LeMay?
Well, basically, his role was to make sure that none of the men in SAC, or that the intelligence was such that they were always protected, and SAC was just, the whole deal was to drop the bomb. Okay, his thing was a support group to the strategic pilots that had the bombs on board to fly to Russia. And that, at that time, SAC always called the war the 40-minute war.
They would say it was the 40. Why would they call it the 40-minute war, Jan?
By the time they got over Russia and they dropped the bombs and Russia got over us, the whole Holocaust would take about 40 minutes. And that's what the military, it might have been a little bit of a joke, but everybody always laughed about the 40-minute war. They didn't call it a 2-year
Kind of like
war.
gallows humor, so to speak.
Right.
You also said that your husband, in addition to being in military intelligence and the Strategic Air Command, he was also CIA attached as well.
Absolutely.
How do you know that for a fact?
Well, at one time he would go off at a given amount of time. One of the things I know he did with the CIA had a lot to do with when we were having trouble with Ireland. With Northern Ireland. Right, and when we were in Rome, I had to drive him. Strange things happen around our house with intelligence. I had to drive him to meet a certain fellow that I put him in the car with, and they told me not to tell anyone that he and this fellow were gone. And I think when he retired, or when he was forced to retire, that he...
Why was he forced to retire?
Because he was drinking so much then, he was sitting at Harry's bar drinking instead of doing his job.
I interrupted you. So you said when he retired, you thought...
Well, he was forced to retire.
Okay. And so you think he was CIA as well, doing certain missions for them?
When he left Rome, by then he was in CIA. Yeah. They never drop them. They stay as long as they can keep these experienced intelligence.
Well, did he ever tell you he was CIA, or you just kind of deduced it, or...
No,
how would you know?
They never tell him.
How would you know he was CIA then?
Because he used to go off on these strange trips that had nothing to do with the particular job he was doing, and I think a lot of them switched CIA to
military intelligence, back and forth.
I mean, they're all those crazy intelligent people.
So give us your opinion of people in intelligence. What did you say about them? Go give us the unvarnished opinion of them.
They are cold-blooded. Cold-blooded to the point that we always joked and said that the intelligence people would turn their own children, their mothers, their wives in to get a case. And that's how they're trained. I mean, if they're good at it, they are trained to do that.
Well, the phrase you used earlier off camera was that you think they're all psychopaths. Is that
I said that, and that's basically what you have to be to do the type of job they want you to do.
Meaning someone without a conscience.
Without much conscience, right. I mean, if you couldn't get you got homosexuals. That was when...
You mean capture, expose. So they're always...
Oh, absolutely.
You told me off camera they were always taking people down. Right. Your husband was. Absolutely. Whether it was a spy or subversive
Russian.
or a homosexual in the U.S. military, right?
And the homosexual thing in the military was terrible. Then they were just court-martial them right and left. So... And I think that's over now. Isn't it true that now the military has
It's over. It's over.
Yeah, well then, that was one of their big jobs. They used to joke, his friends used to joke and call him the queer chaser.
The queer chaser.
But that's not
Well, what about the drive-in movie theaters chasing homosexuals there?
Oh, Lord, yes. They would go. That was the best place because...
To catch them.
The barracks, to catch them, because the barracks had all kind of things to check to be sure nothing went on in the BOQs, Bachelor Officer Quarters. So then they would go to drive-in movies and various things, because that was part of their job. It was the same job to catch a homosexual as it would to catch a subversive,
or a communist spy,
to catch a communist spy. And all of it was based in to get them, just get them.
And they would catch them maybe having sex in the back of a car at a drive-in movie theater and then bring a case against them, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, all right, one last thing here, Jan. Tell us about the special gun that your husband, Colonel William Henry Amos, was given, the one that fired really quick.
When he was guarding Johnson, when he started in the personal security, he was given a weapon that is not out anywhere on the base, and it was a weapon, he said, that had no sort of a lock on the. I'm not familiar with guns, by the way. He never allowed a gun in our home.
No safety lock on the gun.
No safety lock. You got it right. It didn't have a safety lock, and it fired so fast that he kind of jokingly said, "My God, if I don't watch what I'm doing, I'm going to shoot my foot off." So it was special, and I guess they still use them, I don't know, but he had one.
It was a special quick-firing gun.
Special quick-firing, very flat, fit here, and you couldn't see it. And when you got it out and faced it that way, it could almost fire.
So it would fit over your heart, basically.
Yeah, well, I think.
And it was very flat
yeah,
and thin?
Yeah, very thin, very different. You've never seen a weapon like it. He was surprised when he got it.
Well, Jan, I just want to say on behalf of historical researchers everywhere, I want to really thank you for giving us some oral history right here. It's very educational, and I personally had a great time.
Well, I did too, and thank you. And I had no idea all those years with intelligent people. It was a different life, that's for sure.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.